Hey everyone, my name is Amanda Thomas and I'd like to welcome you to A Scientist Walks into a Bar. This podcast features recordings of talks that were given by scientists at events in the Pacific Northwest, generally in Portland, Oregon or Vancouver, Washington. These events and this podcast are created by VIA Productions, and we here at VIA think that it's a lot more fun to learn while having a beer or some other kind of adult beverage. So at these events, generally both the speaker and the audience will be drinking a pint. If you'd like to learn more about the podcast or how to attend one of our Science on Tap events, please check out our website at viaproductions.org.
And if you think about sex, why would you want to do that unless it felt good? I mean, it's kind of weird when you think about it.
That's Dr. Larry Sherman, a neuroscientist at Oregon Health and Science University, talking about lust, chocolate, and prairie voles, the neuroscience of pleasure and love. Larry's research at OHSU deals primarily with figuring out the mechanics of neurodegenerative conditions such as stroke and multiple sclerosis. But in this talk, he turned his attention towards a mental condition that plagues most of us at some point in our lives: being in love. Here's what he had to say at an event in Portland, Oregon.
I do medical research at OHSU. My lab is actually trying to figure out ways to repair brain damage in patients with multiple sclerosis and stroke and also during normal aging. So I'm talking about a subject that I know nothing about tonight. But I also wear this hat. I'm the president of the Society for Neuroscience for the state of Oregon, and I give talks on neuroscience to get people interested. And I spend my time reading these articles and trying to figure out what's good science and what's absolute crap. Tonight I'm going to share some things with you that are good science, I think. So in any case, I am not an expert on this subject. You've already paid your entry fee. You're not getting it back. You might as well enjoy it. Now, when I was asked by Amanda to give this talk, she asked me to do something on pleasure, and I really thought to myself, pleasure, this is beyond love. I mean, the whole, how does the human body deal with pleasure? How does the brain deal with pleasure? And it took me back to Aristotle, Socrates, and Plato. So this evening, I am, in fact, going to quote Aristotle, Socrates, and Plato. I'm finally going to use my goddamn liberal arts education from Reed College. Coming back to those same philosophers I just mentioned, the first question we have to address tonight is, what is pleasure? And Socrates and his student Plato really were the first to define this in Western culture. And the notion of pleasure comes down to a feeling of cheerfulness, if you will, that's brought on by physical pleasure. And sex and eating, of course, are mentioned as part of these physical pleasures. And remarkably, we still really hold on to this notion today that this is a prime example. Now, the other forms are aesthetic pleasure, so admiring beauty, for example, and ideal pleasure. It's intellectual pleasures that they talked about ad nauseum, which to me sounded like hell. But these were sort of their notions of the different levels of pleasure, if you will, and you're trying to really attain this ideal pleasure. Now, Aristotle came along and sort of refined this idea a little bit, and Aristotle came up with this idea of hedonia, which is really what we call pleasure, and this is really the state of cheerfulness, the state of that's being linked to being in a state of pleasure and happiness. So nowadays, we've taken these same hedonic concepts and broken them down into what we call fundamental pleasures, which are the same ones that Plato and Socrates mentioned: food and sex. And obviously, food plus sex is obviously awesome. So, and then these higher order pleasures, so money and art and music, which are things that our frontal cortex is really dealing more with. So-called altruistic pleasures, the notion of giving a present to somebody or giving to a charity. This is something that our brains consider pleasurable. And then transcendental pleasures, which include praying, which include other types of thinking and meditation. So these are all sort of grouped together. What's interesting is the same brain areas are generally used to deal with fundamental pleasures and higher order pleasures. The difference is the higher order pleasures, music for example, really require this frontal cortex that we humans have. These fundamental pleasures, food and sex, that's really our lizard brain talking. And so these are really the things that we need. These are the things that make us human. And they really distinguish themselves in terms of where the activating the brain lights up. Now, why do we have these fundamental pleasures? And I think unless you don't believe in evolution, this is an obvious question. I mean, it's because if we didn't like eating, we wouldn't do very well as a species. And if we didn't like sex, we'd do even worse. And if you think about sex, why would you want to do that unless it felt good? I mean, it's kind of weird when you think about it. So Darwin had this idea that emotions and affective expressions are these adaptive responses that are selected for in our species. And liking is part of that. And we're going to talk about liking and wanting, and that was also coming up as part of our reward systems. And they are really two very different things, and they are dealt with in two very different ways by our brains. Now, this is a great example of this notion that these are evolved features of our brains. These are three different species doing two things. One, a hedonic reaction to a sweet taste. And you can see this in a baby rat, a non-human primate, and a baby human primate. When you give a sweet-tasting something to any of these three, they have the same facial expression. They see the same movement of the tongue, the same movement of the mouth. When you give a aversive reaction, a bitter taste, it's remarkable when you look at the shape of the mouth and the expression on their faces, they're actually exactly the same. So this is something, again, that's part of our primitive brain. This evolved to keep us alive. Bitter reactions usually means there's alkaloids in whatever it is you're tasting. Alkaloids have poison, so you don't want to eat things that are bitter. Sweet things means there's a lot of calories, and God knows we don't need that today, but back then we did, and that was something that was keeping the species going. So given all that, where does pleasure happen in the brain? And something that I think some people I've talked to don't really kind of understand is when you feel pleasure in part of your body or as part of an emotion, it is in your brain. When you feel pain, it's in your brain. When you stub your toe, what you're feeling isn't in your toe. What you're feeling is in your brain. And that's a hard concept for people to grasp sometimes, but that's true. And you can actually see people who have brain lesions, and if you stub their toe, they don't notice. So this is, again, a notion that pleasure is also not localized to the place in your body where you feel the pleasure. That yummy feeling you get or that sated feeling you get after you've had a nice meal, it's coming from your brain. So all these things are happening in different parts of the brain. And then the question is, do these different types of pleasures we just talked about have different localizations? And I've already sort of hinted to that that's the case. Now, the way we know a lot of the data I'm going to talk about tonight is from a type of a procedure called a functional MRI. How many of you have ever had an MRI? Wow, a lot of you. What's wrong with you people? Have any of you ever had a functional MRI? So functional MRI is a little different than normal MRIs. Now, MRIs, of course, are, for those of you who've had them, are pretty nasty experiences, especially if you're claustrophobic. You're put into this machine. It's extremely loud. They usually give you noise-canceling headphones. And then you can get beautiful images that can make cross-sections through the head or the body and see quite a bit of anatomy. The difference is with a functional MRI, you can actually measure changes in structure in real time. So one of the things you can do, for example, is look at changes in the diameter of blood vessels in the brain, very tiny blood vessels. And one of the things we know about our brains is when our nerve cells need to do something like think, they need more energy, and they get that energy from the bloodstream. So the nerve cells, through cells called astrocytes, will actually communicate with the blood vessel and say, make yourself wider, let more blood flow through so I can extract more energy to do my job. And what you can do then is map this difference in vessel diameter onto a brain and look at what's happening. So this is an individual listening to music compared to not listening to music. And these are the areas of the brain that are lighting up in this person simply as an act of listening to music. So we can do this for any number of activities. Remarkably, there's been some recent studies where they've actually had people look at this during an orgasm. Now, I can't think of a less interesting place to have an orgasm. So I kind of wonder about the validity of that data because there may be something else going on there, but any type of pleasure or displeasurable experience you could probably measure under the situation. So this is a hedonic reaction of a brain to eating something sweet. And so basically all this person was doing was lying there, and then they scanned the brain. They gave them some water, measured that, which had no taste to it, obviously, and then they gave them some sugary water. and this is what happened when they got the sugary water. So you can see a lot of very different areas are lighting up in response to this sweetness, this hedonic reaction, but it's quite localized. It's not everywhere. It's in very specific places. And what we've learned from this, there are many different areas that are involved in this pleasurable hedonic response. One of them, which you're going to hear about again later, is this area right here, just above your eyes. It's called the orbital frontal cortex. And this is an area of the brain where you can look at something and anticipate what it's going to be or what it's like, or you can anticipate that it might be something that you do like, and it's going to send pleasure signals about that and also fire back to memory centers. You also have the hippocampus, which is involved in learning and memory, the amygdala. You have all sorts of other areas involved in emotional responses to different stimuli. The cingulate cortex up here, also involved in this pleasurable response that I'm talking about. And they're all, of course, wired together in these rather amazing circuits. Now, this is a male scan, and this is a female scan. And this study took a number of subjects who were roughly the same age and fed them chocolate, and then scanned the brain for areas that were different. Now, I've pointed out all these different areas of the brain that are involved in these hedonic responses, pleasure. But what's really remarkable is when you compare the male brain and the female brain, in terms of these pleasurable responses, they're quite different. Now, chocolate is rather an interesting subject because people become almost addicted to chocolate. It's hard for some people to walk away from chocolate. And chocolate has effects and has been said to activate similar areas that are activated during orgasm, for example. But what's interesting is if you look in the male brain and the female brain in terms of responses to chocolate, the reactions are actually very different. And this is true for other hedonic responses as well. And it raises the question, how do women versus men experience pleasure? Are there real differences in perception? Because there really are very different areas that are lighting up or turning off as a result of these hedonic stimuli. Now, I mentioned that there's this liking and wanting. And liking is really a process whereby you experience something, and this is where you're having that really strong hedonic reaction. Liking means you've experienced something and you're having pleasure from it, like this person eating chocolate. And when you look at the hedonic centers of the brain, one of the things that becomes clear is that it's really a process that avoids opioid receptors. These are proteins on nerve cells that respond, as their name suggests, to opium or other types of molecules. And these mu-opioid receptors are localized in many different places in the brain. And one of the things that we know is that opioid receptors, one of the things they do is they make you feel euphoric. They make you feel really good. And in fact, we know this from studies on things that bind to opioid receptors that are not endogenous or opioid types of molecules that are in our bodies, but rather from things like morphine and opium and heroin and other molecules that bind to these same proteins and turn them on. So why then does this thing that causes euphoria, why are these molecules I just mentioned used to treat pain? And the reason for that is that pleasure can actually limit pain in terms of your response. So if you think about a pain syndrome here, if you have a lot of pleasure with your pain, the pain's not so bad. If you have pleasure plus activation of mu-opioid receptors, something that blocks those mu-opioid receptors, you get more pain. So the pleasure is going and activating those mu-opioid receptors. If you block them, now you have as much pain as you had before, if not more. Now, if you have pleasure, you can do the same thing. If you have pleasure and you have pain, there's less pleasure. So if you're doing something that's really fun but it hurts, wouldn't it be funner if it didn't hurt? So here we have the opposite thing, which is where you can have pleasure plus pain, but now you added a mu-opioid agonist, something that turns on the receptor, like morphine, and now you can have a situation where you have more pleasure, or at least regular pleasure. So this is actually, believe it or not, it's as simple as that, the theory for how a lot of modern painkillers work. It's all about tricking your body into thinking that there's more pleasure than pain involved in what you're experiencing. Now, you can lose pleasure. And in fact, loss of pleasure has a name, anhedonia, which makes sense from what I just told you. And what is believed to happen in people who have lost the ability to like something or to like certain experiences is that they've lost liking signaling. And some of those areas I told you about, there's a lot of different liking signaling areas. So you can imagine a lot of conditions which might cause that to happen. Now, it may involve liking, trading liking for disliking. And when you think about it, disliking is also an important evolutionary concept. I mentioned the notion of eating something bitter. We make that face. So sometimes your brain converts liking signals into disliking signals, and that's why people fail to like things. Now, this can be reversed, interestingly, by deep brain stimulation, by electrically implanting implants into some of these areas of the brain which are involved in these liking signals and ramping them up. So you can get somebody who's lost this liking ability to become someone who can sort of like better. The problem is, because liking does involve multiple areas, it's hard to do that in a way that's really, truly meaningful. I mean, to the point where it's going to overcome the problem altogether. But it's going to make things better. And that's certainly true for depression, because a major symptom of depression is the inability to like. You've lost the liking signaling. Now, when you like something, it makes you kind of want that thing. That makes sense, right? You see it, you like it, you want more of it. So wanting, it turns out, is a process that's driven by a completely different set of circuits, although there is some overlap, and different neurochemicals. And one of those chemicals is a chemical called dopamine. Now, dopamine has different pathways. The prefrontal cortex, for example, is involved. Nucleus accumbens is an area in the brain right about here. And this area here, called the ventral tegmental area, these are all major dopamine pathways in the brain. And these are areas that get turned on when you're in that state of wanting something that you've previously liked. Now, liking means increased opioid receptor activity. That leads to wanting, which leads to increased dopamine activity. Now, this can feed back then to the point where if you encounter the thing that you want and you like it again, this is a reward signal. So you've just now made a reward circuit. The problem is, you can imagine this becomes not such a good thing if you don't interrupt it sometimes. And I had a roommate like that in college, actually. So our brains have ways to take care of this, and there are signals that sort of turn down the wanting or turn down the liking. For example, you like chocolate, but after a while you become satiated, and even chocoholics get to the point where they kind of don't feel so good anymore if they eat any more chocolate. That's saving your life. So that's a good thing. And so what happens is the liking signal bends more towards the disliking signal by lowering the receptor activity of those opioid receptors. Or it goes to a not wanting signal, where you lower the amount of dopamine that's being driven there. There's also these receptors, these proteins that bind to dopamine and respond to dopamine, and they sometimes get turned down. So now you get that wanting signal kind of turned way down, and you don't really want it as much as you did before. There's another component to this, too, and we'll talk about this one a little bit more later. It turns out that there's another molecule, it's another neurotransmitter called serotonin. And serotonin is actually been implicated in giving you that sense of well-being when it's at the right level. If you take it away, you actually get depression. And so liking to wanting can be modulated in part by serotonin signaling, which might be leading you to that sense of flourishing human activity. As I've implied, when you disrupt this signaling the wrong way, this is what happens when you have addiction. This is just a little circuit of the dopamine pathway in part of the brain. Each of these is another nerve cell that has a different set of parts of the circuit. You have all these different places where an external drug can affect that pathway. And what it's doing is it's driving the wanting signal way up. So when you snort cocaine, it drives your dopamine through the roof to abnormally high levels. And the problem is, it's so high that the next time you snort cocaine, you need to snort more to get that dopamine higher because your body's trying to turn down the volume. And so it goes into this wanting loop. What happens is, addiction is wanting without liking. You have this desire to have this over and over again, even though you know it's not good for you, even though you know the consequences of it are bad. Alcoholism is another example of that. So it's a situation where this dopaminergic signaling is overcoming your cortical signaling, which is your reasoning centers to kind of get you through this, but also kind of bypassing the whole liking phase of what you are experiencing. A great example of this came from studies both in animals and humans, where they were trying to identify the parts of the brain involved in this process. And so they could give you so-called pleasure electrodes. And for the longest time, people thought this was really what pleasure was. They would insert these electrodes into these parts of the brain, like the ventral tegmental area that I just mentioned, and then the rat would just push a button wanting that over and over and over again. Or the person who has stimulation in these brain areas would suddenly feel this incredible euphoria and want more and more and more of it. They would want it to the point where they would not eat or drink. So this is a remarkable physiological phenomenon that is driving an addictive type of behavior. But again, you don't have liking happening here. So you don't have a chance for a hedonic response that's going to give you a better quality of life. So if you look at the areas using that fMRI procedure I was telling you about that are involved in wanting versus liking, people used to think that these were really tied together, and it turns out they're not. It turns out they're very separate parts of the brain. So for example, this is just one area of the brain where you look at a so-called hedonic hotspot. So this is, again, you can feed somebody chocolate in the MRI machine, make sure the metal wrapper's off of it first, and hotspots will light up. Other areas will go blank. In other words, activity will go away. And then you have a disliking area which may decrease around it, but then a broader area around that of cells that are wanting hotspots. So this is an example of how these circuits really, they overlap to some degree, but they really are quite distinct in terms of what they're doing. And that explains really at the circuit level why you can have this addictive phenomenon. I mentioned that the hippocampus, this area involved in learning, is also part of this hedonic response, and that's because we learn what's good and what's not good, what we like and what we don't like. And that learning center can also, by the way, become disrupted in addictive types of phenomena. So these things have to all integrate, wanting, liking, and learning, both at the conscious and subconscious levels. We have ways to measure all of these things, and we know where all the different levels of the brain are involved and which chemicals are involved. I've already mentioned dopamine, I've mentioned serotonin, and the opioids. Now, we've set up a general discussion about pleasure and what we like and what we don't like and how we want wanting and liking. What about love? Love is a real special case of fluctuating wanting and liking. It's something we all either have experienced or certainly want to experience. And the question, of course, comes back to what is love? Plato, a severe mental disease, and a score of 0 in tennis. We need a scientific definition, though, because I am, after all, a neuroscientist. And so love is really a set of emotions related to a sense of strong affection linked to distinct neurochemical changes in the brain. And I think the really important thing here is these distinct neurochemical changes in the brain that are happening that are causing us to behave like utter loons sometimes. So how do our responses to pleasure and happiness change when we fall in love? Well, one of the things I explored with Valerie Day, for those of you who saw Brain Chemistry for Lovers, was this notion of these stages of love. And what's clear is that we're learning all the time that these stages of love have their own distinct neurochemical changes. And as I alluded to earlier, they seem to be fluctuating changes in liking and wanting signals that are unique compared to the types of things you have when you just want to have some food or when you're listening to some music. So let's start with these different phases. The first phase is lust. Now, I've heard people think that lust is kind of a dirty word, but the fact of the matter is, if you didn't have lust, once again, we wouldn't be here. So you have to have lust. It all starts with that. Now, one of the interesting things about lust is, to have lust, you have to be attracted to somebody in the first place. There's a number of things that happen where we can sense each other and sort of sample each other to make sure we're right for each other. And that does not involve a reality TV show. One of them is visual cues. And for men in particular, but also women, visual cues are extremely important. Smell is an incredibly important sense that we do when we sample each other, when we meet somebody. We can smell if we're compatible, and I'll get to that in a minute. And then finally, taste. So visual cues are extremely important. and there's a reason why the porn industry does so well. We can stimulate sexual desire, we can stimulate lust signaling with just a visual cue. It doesn't have to be physical. And it's true for men, but it's also true for women, but more so for men. And it's not only true, obviously, for heterosexuals. So the visual cue in homosexuals is also the same thing. You have an attraction, something about that person that is visually appealing to you. Now, this attraction starts in that part of the brain I talked about before, just above our forehead, the orbital frontal cortex. And what happens is two people will meet each other and see each other from across a crowded room, or as these two are, from the street to the window, and they'll sort of have a reaction to each other. So they like each other, and what happens then is their eyes lock on each other. Now, this eye locking business is really pretty fascinating, and it can happen, like I said, even at great distances. And if both eyes lock simultaneously, and it lasts for many seconds, something goes off in this orbital frontal cortex, part of the brain, that stimulates this initial phase of lust. It actually starts stimulating pretty significant chemical changes that will push things along. And if it's happening to the same degree in both brains, hopefully one of you will get the other one's phone number, and things will go on from there. A couple other things have to happen. It can't just be attraction. There's a few things that will dictate if you are attracted to each other, and it turns out it has to do with the levels of two hormones we've all heard of. Testosterone, which is right here, this throbbing molecule right here, and estrogen. Testosterone and estrogen are not specific sex hormones. Women have testosterone, men have estrogen, just not as much. So obviously the levels are inverted. But the levels of testosterone and estrogen in each person will dictate how attractive they find that other person in a number of different ways. And some of the most interesting studies have suggested that, for example, testosterone and estrogen levels can influence a preference for more masculine versus feminine facial features in men, depending on our cycle of testosterone, for example, and our cycles of estrogen. And this is just a study where one face was taken and made it more or less feminine or more or less masculine, and people were asked to tell their preferences, and then they took a blood test, and their testosterone levels were measured, and they came back later, and they saw that there were changes that dictated which facial features you preferred. The same turns out to be true in women. Women, at different periods of their cycles, will prefer more feminine to more masculine faces. Now, given that we can sort of promote that sort of behavior somewhat, what with estrogen and testosterone, of course, a lot of people have tried to figure out, can we make love potion number 9? And there's an interesting fact, and that is that we know in the animal kingdom there are pheromones which will promote sexual behavior. And these pheromones are very powerful hormones and neurochemicals, but there's no proven pheromones per se in humans. Having said that, there are these studies that have been done where people have been taking shirts that have been worn by men, and then they hang these shirts up in front of women, and women have these really amazing preferences for the smell of the sweat. And it turns out the scent that they really seem to prefer is somehow linked to differences in this molecule right here, which is actually a group of proteins that make up a complex called the major histocompatibility complex, or MHC. And MHC is different in different people, and it kind of dictates your immune response to foreign bodies. So if you're more compatible with somebody, you have an MHC class that is compatible as opposed to uncompatible. And you can smell it in people's sweat. I think that's really bizarre. But it's true. Now, the other thing is, this preference, as we alluded to, disappears when you're on oral contraceptives, and that's because the preference depends on the cycling happening. So if you don't have the cycling happening, the preference goes away. So if you're on the pill, you may have a higher rate of picking the wrong guy, just to warn you. Anybody know what I mean? So interestingly, men prefer the scent of women who are ovulating. And it's, again, a subconscious thing. You don't know it, but there's this scent, and it's, again, an olfactory sensation that's driving this behavior. taste is really remarkable, and what we're tasting, it turns out, when we kiss each other is, again, this MHC molecule. So when you kiss somebody and your brain says, oh, I really like the way this person tastes, what your brain's telling is that your children are having a better outcome if you get married and have children, or don't get married and have children, or whatever it is you want to do. I mean, it's up to you. But this taste is actually a sampling mechanism. So we're using all of our facial senses. Hearing, I suspect also, if there's somebody who sounds really annoying to you, you probably shouldn't hook up with them. So now, how do we go from this lust to the next phase, which is that romantic love phase, which some people also call infatuation, and other people call a mental disease, like Plato suggested, which is the madness phase of love. So this is a situation where you've gone out on a few dates, and now that both of you are just thinking about each other all the time, you're texting each other at work, you're sending emails back and forth, you're not getting any work done, your friends are they think you're driving them nuts, let's be honest, and it's not good. But you just want to spend your time with this other person. Well, it turns out that this is being driven in a couple of different areas, which I've already mentioned, this caudate nucleus part of the brain here, and this area here, that ventral tegmental area that I mentioned before, that was involved in dopamine responses. So as you might guess, in fact, dopamine is part of the formula here. In fact, there's a group of neurotransmitters that include dopamine. They're called monoamines. Now, all of these molecules have the same properties. They're neurotransmitters. So what does that mean? So if you have two nerve cells that are communicating with each other, so you have one here, its signal is coming down this way, and what they do is they release these little vesicles filled with this stuff, these chemicals, these neurotransmitters like dopamine. Those actually pass through a space. Nerve cells aren't connected physically with each other. There's actually a gap between them. It's called the synaptic cleft. And this space then fills up with these molecules, which then bind to proteins on the other side, on this nerve cell, and they propagate that signal, that electrical signal, down. And this happens extremely fast. So dopamine is certainly one of these monoamines that's involved in this cocktail of love, if you will. When you're in that phase where you just can't stop thinking of each other, it's found at extremely high levels in the brains of people who are in love. And as I've already mentioned, people who are also shopaholics, have gambling problems, eating too much chocolate, cocaine abusers, you name it. Now, another one that we haven't mentioned yet is a monoamine called epinephrine, which also is called adrenaline. And this molecule is involved in the fight or flight response. So we've known about this molecule for a long time. It's made in the adrenal glands, so-called adrenal medulla. And if you're in a cave and you walk into a bear, this stuff goes through the roof. Your heart starts beating, you start sweating, and you're getting your body ready to either run or fight. Why you would want to do that on a date, I don't know. But in fact, for new lovers who are on dates, who are in that stage of infatuation, these are the symptoms you often see. You see sweaty hands, increased heart rate, and your mouth goes dry, which is just really attractive. Maybe that's what it is. If you can get over that, then... So serotonin comes back to haunt us again, too. In this case, it's doing some different things, though. One of the things that serotonin can do is it can alter your mood and your sleep and your appetite. So when you're madly in love with somebody, remember that first love, you just couldn't stop thinking about them, you weren't sleeping well, you didn't want to eat, your heart was all aflutter. Serotonin was what was driving that process. Interestingly, Donatella Marazziti found that serotonin levels in people who are in love were as high as the levels in people with obsessive-compulsive disorder. So love really is an illness. So now, what happens when one person becomes obsessed with another, but the other person couldn't care less? And this is work by Dorothy Chenoff. It's called Limerence. You have Bob, and you have Alice. And Alice has fallen head over heels in love with Bob, and Bob doesn't know and doesn't care, and really wish he would just move along. This is a state of limerence. What happens in people who are in this state may sound familiar to you from what I just talked to you about in terms of addiction. Alice is going to have intrusive thinking about Bob all the time, so she can't get her mind off of Bob. She's going to have an acute longing for reciprocation from Bob. She's going to fear rejection, and she'll have unsettling shyness whenever she's around Bob. There's going to be a tendency to exaggerate Bob's good qualities and to overlook Bob's bad qualities. And there's going to be an extraordinary ability to interpret just anything he says, Bob, as a sign of his passion for her. So you can imagine how painful this would be. And in fact, this is really a great example of wanting without liking. This is a situation where every signal she's getting, even though none of them are giving her a real, true feeling of liking, are driving her to want more. Now, this is a problem because this is exactly the type of state that leads to stalking-type behavior. And in fact, in early phases of limerence, people are actually finding that the limerence subject is spending 30% of their time thinking about that other person. That's an awful lot of your daytime to think about another person. This could rise to 100% in severe situations. It can lead to depression as well as suicide, and it can also lead to stalking behaviors, as I mentioned. And it comes back to serotonin signaling. Low serotonin levels actually can drive this process because it's not acting as the proper break between the liking and the wanting signals anymore. On that happy note, we've gone through 2 phases of love. Phase 1, which is driven by our sex hormones, estrogen and testosterone. Phase 2, which is driven by our monoamine cocktail, and we're just having a great time. One of the things that we know that drives these spikes in dopamine, for example, are orgasms. And so we've been having lots of orgasms, hopefully, and that's just making us feel great. But eventually, it's not quite as great anymore, and things kind of settle down a little bit. And so now you have this next phase where we go from this passion, intimacy phase to the area where the monoamine cocktail's out. The booze is all gone. And we go to phase 3, where we have to make a decision. This is a big decision point. Commitment or rejection. Now, these are areas, again, this decision is driven by this cingulate cortex up here in the brain. And one of the things that we know that rejection does is it actually is signaled by reduced dopamine highs. So if you're in a situation where that dopamine high is making you feel good, that it's like an addiction, right? And now the dopamine highs are going away. Your dopamine receptors are becoming downregulated. The person isn't as interesting as she or he used to be. The dopamine's not spiking the way it used to. What's remarkable is there are people who are extreme at this, who will be with somebody and their dopamine spikes, and they're all excited about that person, and the next morning, they're not excited anymore. The first person who comes along, who looks a little better, is exciting again. And that is enough to drive the dopamine levels back and the receptors back to that level where they were before. So that's kind of unnerving to me because you want to think that some people have this notion that they can stick with a relationship a little more than 2 nights. The other thing that can actually change your drive for a person in terms of driving you to the point of rejection is reduced testosterone levels, both in men and women. And this can actually drive a lack of interest and a lack of aggressive behavior that makes things less interesting and, again, comes back to that dopamine high. Interestingly, another hormone called prolactin seems to be a brake for dopamine. And we need this hormone because otherwise we would just be having sex all the time and we'd forget to eat and then we'd die before we had babies. Again, bad for the species, right? So this prolactin, however, it can be much higher in some people than others. And so that dopamine high is very brief for those people, and they never really get into the other people. So there's a lot of reasons that can explain rejection. There's been an idea that dopamine therapies could be used to target a broken heart. Interestingly, though, the thing that really is remarkable about a person who's been rejected is that the parts of the brain that become activated are the parts of the brain that are related to pain. So physical pain is something people have when they've broken up with somebody. And there's been a study recently suggesting that ibuprofen actually can reduce some of that physical pain. Now, I don't want you all to go out and start taking ibuprofen if you've just been dumped. But if you're having that sense of horrible headaches and pain-associated feelings, it might help a little bit to get the edge off. And if it doesn't get the edge off, then you may need some more help than that. Or you need to go clubbing, I don't know which. But So there are certainly ideas that you could stop addiction by targeting the dopamine pathway, but there's also just general pain pathway things you can do to get over a broken heart. Now, many drugs used to treat depression target monoamines, and so again, depression is also a side effect of a broken heart, but none of them are that great, and I certainly don't think we all need to undergo deep brain stimulation or electroconvulsive shock therapy to get over being dumped. And I have to argue that being dumped is part of life. It's something we have to all experience at some point, and that's a growing thing, and it's probably good for your brain to get over that at some point on its own. Let's get away from rejection and try to end the night on a happy note, which is, well, happy for some anyway, commitment. And that's phase 3. Now, how do people become committed to one another? This is a great question, and there's been some amazing research recently about this, and it all comes back to prairie voles. Prairie voles are cute little critters. As their name suggests, they live in the prairies. And prairie voles are remarkable because, unlike almost every other rodent on the planet, they're monogamous. In fact, very few mammals are monogamous. These animals will stay with their mates throughout life. They will help rear the young, the males will. That's something you just don't see in the rodent world or the mammal world in general. Now, as opposed to the prairie voles, the guys over here, the montane voles, who are very, very similar, genetically 99% similar, they're promiscuous. They fool around. These guys, they go from one girl to the next, it's off to the bar to brag about it, and that's how they behave. And that's a normal rodent behavior. What's remarkable is people were looking at the brains of these animals and comparing centers of the brain that were different in response to these different mating types of behaviors. And what they found was that molecules involved in vasopressin and oxytocin were very different and higher in different localizations in the prairie voles compared to the montane voles. Now, what are these molecules? Oxytocin, we've known about it for years. It's actually a hormone that deepens feelings between lovers. We've known that. It's important for cervical dilation before labor and contractions, part of that let-down reflex you have when you're nursing. It's released during orgasm in both men and women at high levels, and it promotes this monogamous bonding in the prairie voles, it turns out. So that was pretty remarkable. Now, vasopressin is another hormone that's also been linked to bonding. It regulates water retention. Why it would do that for love, I don't know, but that's what its other functions. It's critical for long-term memory formation in the hippocampus, interestingly. But it also has this ability to promote bonding by the male voles. What's remarkable is if you inject vasopressin into male mice that never pair bond, you will start to see pair bonding behavior in the male mice. What's more, they identified the differences in the vasopressin and the oxytocin. It turns out that it was a very subtle genetic change. Now, for those of you who don't deal with DNA every day, just a reminder for everybody else, DNA is made up of a 4-letter code, A, T, C, and G. And these genes that encode the proteins that I just mentioned are made up of huge numbers of these A's, T's, C's, and G's. And what they found was that in the prairie voles, they had a very subtle change. One of those letters in one of the genes was different. And that was enough to change its behavior and activity, and it actually caused this huge behavioral change. So you went from a wild party animal to a caring, committed partner because of one letter change in one gene. Now, that's pretty remarkable. And the way they knew that was they could take that gene and actually make mice, we call them transgenic mice, where we spliced that DNA from the prairie vole into the mouse, and now the mouse the male mice were committed to the female, and they helped rear the young. So that, to me, is remarkable, and it's something that, as a neuroscientist, I never would have suspected that a single minor change in one gene could have such profound changes and effects on behavior. especially a complicated behavior. So the question then becomes, what about us? Well, it turns out men with small changes in a protein that binds to vasopressin are more likely to cheat. Again, a single letter base pair change. This was reported just a few years ago. So what was interesting about this study was they found men and they looked at them. The percentages vary because there's been other studies since then. It's 30-40% of men have this. And what's remarkable is when they looked at men who had this and they asked their partners how satisfied they are with the relationship, the ones who had the change, partners were never satisfied. They felt that they couldn't trust them. They didn't feel like they were ever able to have a committed relationship with them. And then you looked at the divorce rates in those men, and it was very high compared to the men who didn't have that change. So again, that is shocking to me. It's not conclusive evidence that that one single base pair change in that DNA sequence was enough to cause this huge change in behavior. But it's suggestive, and it's rather remarkable. So is there something you can do about that? Well, there's actually a study, believe it or not, to make oxytocin nose drops for people who have problems with commitment. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think I'd want to be snorting nose drops all the time just to stay with somebody, do you? I mean, and I'm not sure I'd want to be with somebody who had to take nose drops to stay with me. Oh, honey, I'm just not feeling it tonight. Wait. Oh, yeah. I love you. But if they can make it, someone will buy it, I'm sure. So I've taken you through another example of pleasure, the special example, which is love, gone all the way from lust to commitment. I hope that all of you wind up on a path that keeps you happy one way or the other. And I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. I'll be posting more episodes soon on lots of other subjects, including other talks by Dr. Larry Sherman on topics such as the neuroscience of racism. If you'd like to find out more about the podcast or what's coming up at our Science on Tap events in Portland and Vancouver, please visit our website at viaproductions.org or check us out on Facebook at facebook.com/scienceontap_ORWA. That last little part stands for Oregon and Washington. Before I go, I'd like to say a special thank you to my friends and volunteers, the Minions. They do so much behind the scenes at the events to make things run smoothly, from hauling equipment around to getting the speaker a beer to pressing record so that we can have a podcast. The Minions are Scott Fry, Michelle Herman, Sam Lauk, Ashley Miller, Rita Nygren, Katie Parsons, Stephen Perry, Antje Spethman, and Chris Trone. You guys are great, and I really couldn't do this without you. Also, a final thank you to Jonathan Coulton for letting us use his song Mandelbrot Set as our theme music.
You're a heart-shaped box of springs and wire, one badass fucking fractal, and you're just